Hello all, thank you for joining Duke Science and Society for the second of our coronavirus conversations. My name is Tim McDermott and I am the event manager at Duke Science and Society. I am broadcasting here from my home studio in Durham, North Carolina. Just a few brief housekeeping. Moderator for today's conversation. The chat is open and we encourage you to post questions you would like the panelists to answer in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat and we will try and get to as many questions as we possibly can. The chat moderators are Ben Shepard and Tim McDermott, so feel free to send me and Ben. The goal of these conversations really is to gather together in an informal setting to discuss the science and tech issues that we're facing right now, and to make sure that the information that we're presenting is shared as widely as possible. So we encourage everyone in attendance to share this information and information gathered in future events as widely as possible within their networks. Finally, should we experience any technical difficulties during this event and you lose connection to the meeting, please go to your email and rejoin with the link in your email. All right, so now that we have that all out of the way, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's event. Buzz Waitzkin is the Deputy Director of Science and Society, the Director of Graduate Studies for Science and Society, and a Senior Lecturing Fellow. So with that, I am going to go ahead and hand it over to our Deputy Director and have him take it away.
Good. I'm unmuted, but I don't yet have a video. There we go.
Ah.
Excellent. Welcome everyone and good afternoon to this coronavirus conversation on rationing, shortages, and triage, pandemics and medical decision making. It's my pleasure and honor to host this conversation between Dr. Peter Ubel and Dr. Monica Lemmon. I don't see Peter yet. I see Monica, but not yet Peter. Hi, Monica. Tim, can you, there we go. Peter Ubel and Monica Lemmon are now in everybody's view. Let me make very brief introductions and then we'll start the discussion. Both Peter and Monica are on the faculty at Duke University. Peter is a university professor of business, public policy, and medicine. And I think that multi-training, multi-perspective view on these issues is important because as we look at issues of rationing and shortages, these are not only decisions to be made by doctors, but they're decisions, including doctors, of course, but should be made from multiple perspectives. And importantly, Peter's training and expertise in behavioral economics really gives a different perspective on what the consequences of these decisions are. All choices are not always obvious in terms of what their downstream consequences are. And one of the things I hope we'll explore here in the conversation is not just the top tier decision making, but the later effects. Dr. Monica Lemmon is a professor in pediatrics and population health. She's a practicing pediatric neurologist, and near and dear to our heart, she teaches clinical bioethics in our Master's in Bioethics and Science Policy, and is clearly attuned to the kinds of issues and is in the hospital daily dealing with these problems as they affect her patients. So we're all, as we know, are faced with as a result of the coronavirus. There are shortages everywhere. Shortages of ventilators, gloves, masks, hospital beds, personnel, and space. And the question of how we make allocation decisions in times of shortage is what we're going to try and explore today, and what the consequences of those decisions are, and then how those decisions impact the decisions of the other people in the system, both patients and doctors. So let me start with the two of you, which is the one, indeed, I think the most difficult question. You have two patients, one ventilator. You have to make a choice as to who's going to get use of the ventilator. The person who gets the ventilator may live. The person who doesn't get the ventilator will die. How do you make those decisions? How do we as a doctor, how do we as a system, how do we as a society make those choices? Who wants to start?
Oh, Monica's going to start.
Oh, good job,
Sure.
Peter.
Thanks for that vote of confidence. So I'll say that, first and foremost, these are tragic things to be thinking about. And when we talk about how to consider resource allocation, fundamental to that conversation is recognizing that we're in a public health emergency, and that really it is that emergency and those shortages that trigger a different way of thinking about how we make decisions about life-sustaining treatment. There have been a number of ways that different hospitals and systems have proposed allocating critical care resources over time, and the more recently developed framework coming out of Pittsburgh from Doug White and Bernard Lowe is one that's being adopted more commonly by hospitals in states around the country, in the United States and abroad. And that framework is something called the multi-principal allocation framework. And it differs from how we made these decisions or how we thought about decisions previously in two fundamental ways. First, it recognizes that thinking about mortality acutely in isolation is likely insufficient, and that thinking about one principle is likely insufficient as we think about such tragic and complicated choices. And so it proposes the use of two primary principles to think about allocating resources. The first is saving the most lives. The second is saving the most life years, as informed by comorbidities that might be life-limiting. The second big way that framework differs from things that have been put forward previously is that it entirely takes out this idea that there should be a priori exclusion criteria, specifically certain groups of people or groups of conditions for which ventilators should never be available. And so as we think about, as a hospital, as a state, and as hospitals are thinking about this globally, hospitals have to make a choice around if they're going to include things like exclusion criteria, to use a framework like this to allocate that last ventilator. And as it stands, most hospitals are moving towards this idea that more than one principle is necessary.
Well, Peter, let me push this to you. When applying the notion of saving the most life years or the most likely life, that has important implications for the disability community. So people who come into that setting, someone's entirely healthy, someone has a longstanding disability, it would seem that under those criteria, you most likely would prefer the person without the disability to the disability. Appropriate set of criteria?
Well, I think have to be a little bit careful what you mean about how disability could play into this. So if somebody has a spinal cord injury and they're not able to walk, that has no impact on both their chance of surviving the initial hospitalization, nor their chance of living 5, 10, 15, 20 years beyond hospitalization. So just having a disability isn't going to factor in, and certainly shouldn't factor into that. Now, if disability is that you have class 4 heart failure, it's a disability and it's a terrible illness, and it typically means you might not have 15, 20 years to live, then if you're trying to maximize the number of people who survive the hospital stay with your aggressive care, and then secondly, you're trying to maximize the number of people who live for 3, 4, 5 years beyond that, those people would receive lower priority.
Monica, what are the social implications of that? You're muted, Monica. Tim, can we turn Monica's mic back on? There we go.
There we go. I lost the ability to unmute myself. So, I think everyone appropriately is thinking really hard about how we disentangle the ideas of using things that are life limiting to inform decisions about who gets a scarce resource, and making decisions up front that certain types of lives or certain types of conditions have less inherent social worth than others. And I think an important distinction that should be made in protocols, and that is made in many, that when we talk about comorbidities, we are talking about those comorbidities that limit life. We are not talking about comorbidities that may have a perceived less value, or some people might perceive to have a lower quality of life, recognizing that we're very bad at predicting these things.
Well, the incidence of, let's focus just on the comorbidities that might affect life. The incidence of certain kinds of comorbidities, whether it's hypertension or diabetes or certain heart conditions, have a greater incidence in certain minority populations than they do in others. So isn't there a rather explicit bias built into those criteria that suggests that minority populations or other medically disadvantaged populations will get treated much more poorly when those decisions are being made?
I think one of the most unsettling and ugliest things about COVID-19 more broadly, and also as we think about these criteria, are that they have the potential to amplify existing health disparities and existing places in our healthcare system where certain communities are placed at risk. And so, yes, the answer to your question is you're correct. Those comorbidities certainly may place additional risk on those populations who are already disenfranchised.
And we've certainly seen a much larger impact in those communities from the disease. And now what we're suggesting is that when those people do manage to get to a place where they can obtain medical treatment, they're less likely to get the highest level of care. Shouldn't we be reversing those social disparities through our decision making rather than enhancing them?
Well, I'll jump in. Yeah, I think you have to think, what's the right time and place to address these disparities? Is it when there is a life-threatening pandemic and a shortage of ventilators, and you're trying to save the most lives you can? And at that point, are you going to say, well, no, we'll just save fewer lives because we want to help people out who, through a whole collision of forces, have a higher rate of comorbidities? I think it needs to just focus us on the importance of trying to address the primary problem outside of the pandemic and trying to help promote the health of lots of communities in this country. I personally don't think that we undo that wrong by giving ventilators to people who are less likely to survive the hospital stay.
Right. Monica, any further thoughts on that topic? Needless to say, a highly controversial question on which people have very strongly divergent opinions, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'll just add, I don't know the right answer. I think this is a tragic thing to think about, and many hospitals are deciding to avoid comorbidity criteria entirely because of issues like this one.
Well, it's been suggested in some settings, for example, that we just use a strict age-based criteria. That would eliminate any of these issues about prior disadvantages with respect to access to healthcare. What's wrong with just a straight age-based criteria? Younger people are in all likelihood likely to live longer than older people, so why don't we just equalize it by using some arbitrary numeric scale rather than building in these implicit and explicit biases?
Yeah, so I wouldn't call it arbitrary. I mean, age is actually a real thing. So first I'd say that there's whether we should factor age in at all and whether it should be the only thing we factor in, right? So if in either case, it's controversial to pay attention to age. I'll tell you that surveys of people in the country, when asked how they'd want to divvy up scarce life-saving resources, the vast majority of the general public says they want age to play a role in that, and that includes older people who are surveyed. In addition, if we think of the disparities that you brought up earlier, Buzz, if you just had an age-based cutoff, say at some point you decide 85 years and older, we're not going to have to be able to ventilate, and then it gets tighter and you're going to have to go to 80 years and older. It's tragic of those, I mean, as incredibly tragic as those choices would be to make. They actually would undo some of those disparities because the age is not a race-based age cutoff, it's just an age cutoff. And it turns out that the typical the 70-year-old Black American is going to have a shorter life expectancy than the 70-year-old Caucasian American. But an age-based criteria wouldn't pay attention to that. It would just say 70 is 70 is 70.
Well, Monica, let's look at the bottom end of that scale. You're seeing pediatric patients. Should we be using these same criteria when we when we have to make a decision about which children should be treated or which child should be treated as against an adult?
Great question. So I think a big challenge for the field is that right now, the majority of protocols that have been put forward either exclusively apply to adults or apply to adults and children in different ways. And so, for example, that multi-principal allocation framework I just mentioned goes down to age 12, but doesn't deal with neonates and doesn't deal with children up to age 12. And it also says, and I think we all would agree, that any protocol we put forward should apply not only to patients with COVID-19, but to patients all over the hospital. And if that's the case at a hospital like Duke or at a hospital that have shared resources between adults and children, we have to come up with a way to think about how resources between children and adults will intersect. Something that I didn't know until learning more recently is that most of the ventilators we use in pediatrics, or certainly a high number, can be used in an adult and vice versa. And so because of that, we really have to think critically about how those two groups are going to intersect as it pertains to allocation decisions. And there's not an obvious way to do that. The scoring systems that are used in adults do have neonatal and pediatric correlates, but they're not nearly as well studied. Children are a lot less likely to be coming in with respiratory failure due to COVID-19, and much more likely to be coming in with something entirely different. And we don't have great scores that kind of level the playing field in that way. And so as a field, as an institution, as a country, we really have a big job ahead of us to think about how to find scores that accurately predict mortality. And if we are going to use comorbidities in children, how we think about that, because it's just as complex, if not more complex in children than it is in adults.
So if, as you suggest, the Pittsburgh criteria, if you will, only apply to people over 12, how do you make a decision when you're choosing between someone who's over 12, who's got a calculated score under the criteria, and someone under 12 who has no score? How do you make that choice?
I think right now, the best we can do is to try to use what we know about predicted mortality in adult and try to think about what it means for that child, and that there are scoring systems one could apply. They're not the same as the ones we might use in an adult, or they're not always the same. But we do know something as it pertains to mortality. And so I think we really have to look at the core feature being used to define that adult's priority score and try to match those core features to a neonate or to a child.
Because there's no reason why those criteria don't apply to children under 12. It's just we've chosen for some policy reason not to do so. And what you're suggesting is that in the real world, even though 0 to 12-year-olds are not strictly covered by the criteria, that's the way it would be handled?
It depends on the institution. So some states and some communities have decided, you know what, we are actually going to try to avoid this altogether. And we're going to do that by cohorting all of the children at one hospital or at a handful of hospitals. Some freestanding children's hospitals, for instance, Levine Children's or CHOP, for example, don't have this issue because they have their own internal cohort of ventilators. You could envision a situation where institutions with shared resources sequestered resources for children and said, we're not going to ration from this group at all. But I think most people agree that if we were going to have a criteria that applies to adults, we have to think about a way for it to also apply to children and children with life-limiting conditions or who have low expected survival.
Well, I think your last comment raises an important question, which is, how do we ensure, or do we attempt to ensure, that there's consistent decision-making across different care settings? Consistent decision-making within a hospital, across different hospitals in different states, or are we in a situation where, depending upon what hospital you go to, which state it's in, and which doctor you happen to get, the decision may be entirely different? How is there a to try and standardize this process going on right now?
I don't think there's a legal way to do that. I don't know that the President of the United States can say, here's the criteria that every hospital in the country has to use. And the same would go for a governor of any kind of state. Now, they could set guidelines out and say, this is what we recommend everybody use. And you could imagine the hospitals in North Carolina getting together and saying, let's all agree to use these criteria so nobody in North Carolina worries about getting different care depending on where they go. But I think that would be great. A voluntary effort is possible. I don't know enough of the law, you might know it, Buzz, whether that could be mandated.
From your experience, has there been any success in standardizing criteria across groups, whether it's across groups of hospitals in North Carolina or even across all of the hospitals that are affiliated with Duke?
Go ahead,
So
Monica.
I'll say that one example where that's been done well is in Pennsylvania, where actually this original protocol was developed. That began with an internal policy that was then broadened to a full health system, that was then taken up by other health systems and ultimately incorporated into state policy. And you could envision something similar happening in North Carolina. I think certainly Duke has a rich group of experts in this content area who've been thinking hard about this for a long time and thinking with other people from across the state about how to ensure everyone gets equitable care.
But is it fair to say that there's a high likelihood under the current circumstance, depending upon which hospital you're in and what state it's in, that the same binary choice that we set up in the first instance may very well be resolved differently? And that a person might have an opportunity to live if they're in Pennsylvania, but might not if they're in Texas, because different criteria are being applied differently.
Yes, that's possible. It's also probably more likely that the outcome is going to depend on how much experience that hospital has taking care of patients as sick as you are, whether you happen to be in a hospital that's really tight for ventilators and maybe there was one 30 miles away that currently isn't, and we're not able to shuttle them around that fast between institutions. So there's like, it's going to be unfair. It's going to be uneven. And I don't think it would, I hope it doesn't cause people a whole lot more worry than they're already experiencing right now. Because I think that most people are going to make these decisions pretty much the same way and are going to work as hard as they can, doubling people up on ventilators, for example, to try to avoid to ever have to make that decision.
Well, one criteria that's notably absent from the calculus you've described is the value that the person is currently contributing to society. So, for example, we do regularly see reports that first priority for, excuse me a second, I don't know why this is happening, I apologize. We often see priority being given with respect to protective equipment and other things to doctors and healthcare providers and first responders. So even within this system, there clearly is a preference being given to certain categories of people who are contributing at that moment more to society than someone else. So even though that's not one of the articulated criteria, that's in fact being utilized. And I would assume that if one of the doctors in the hospital became sick, well, I shouldn't assume. Let me ask you the question. If a doctor in the hospital or a nurse in the hospital becomes sick, would they be given preference to ventilators and other treatments because of the importance of getting them back into the care setting?
And I think that's an important part to add, Buzz, is that it's not about the social value writ large. Like, oh, this is a big CEO somewhere who creates lots of jobs, or this is a famous entertainer that everyone loves, and they'd feel really bummed out if they died. That, I don't know of anybody who's endorsing those criteria. The reason to favor first responders and healthcare workers is actually the same reason you're thinking about, you're trying to expand the number of life years you're saving with the resources you have. And if you have healthcare people who are taken out of their ability to work, you have less people to save other people's lives. So this is really about maximizing healthcare benefit to society. It's not about some people who just happen to be powerful and important.
But setting aside the powerful and important, talk about practical and important utility in this crisis.
Yeah.
Whether it's people that are providing food or people that are providing public safety. Are we applying those criteria as well, implicitly, if not explicitly?
I'll start by saying the short answer to that is not right now. I will also say that many hospitals have not chosen to include any type of what's called sort of an essential worker, critical worker status. And so the Pittsburgh protocol, for example, does incorporate this idea of there are certain people who are essential to the response of the pandemic, who in the setting of essentially needing a heartbreaking tire, for example, that might be used in some way. But that definition, I think, is a bit messy and has large bounds. For example, I would argue that the people that are attending to the rooms in between each patient with COVID-19 should be granted equal status, for example, to an ICU physician who is caring for that same patient. And so trying to think through what defines an essential worker, I think, is a critical challenge with including that clause at all. For what it's worth, many hospital systems have not taken up that essential worker language for exactly this problem, for exactly this reason, because defining the bounds of that, I think, is very complicated.
Well, you have to wonder, obviously it's not in the United States, as Boris Johnson was rolled into the hospital in England, you have to wonder who's relatively older, probably has many comorbidities. You have to wonder whether any of these criteria were applied in making a decision as to whether they're going to provide him with every kind of care available. And obviously he's not a healthcare worker. Let me shift gears entirely to a different topic, which is that the CARES Act, one of the aspects of it was that it, in theory, eliminated any costs of care for people and decisions about whether to go get care for COVID-19 because you can afford it. And basically, it's relatively binary. If you go into the hospital and you're sick, and it turns out that what you had was a result of COVID-19, then you have to pay no bills. If it turns out that you go into the hospital and you had precisely the same condition, but as a result of some other disease or condition, tuberculosis, for example, then you have to pay all your bills. What's the implication of that differentiation? And Peter, this is really for you and your behavioral economics, a system which on its face seems like a really good idea. What are the perverse implications and misaligned incentives that a system like that creates?
The good idea being to relieve people of the cost of COVID testing and treatment? Is that what you mean by the good idea?
Not just testing, but treatment. But
yeah, testing and treatment.
The cost of going to the hospital to be treated for something you think is COVID-19.
Yeah, so it turns out when people face potentially high out-of-pocket costs, they're a little slower to get medical care, which is a very rational approach. But it often means people are diagnosing themselves as this heartburn or a heart attack. And so a lot of us have been arguing that we have to be much more careful how what out-of-pocket costs we expose people to in general, so that we never dissuade people from getting necessary care. In the case of the CARES Act that did relieve people of the out-of-pocket costs associated with testing and treating COVID, that's a great first step. But if I have shortness of breath, is it from influenza? If I have diarrhea, is it from a bacteria or is it from COVID? People don't know. And it would be kind of crazy for someone to go into the hospital, find out that they're sick, but they're sick with the wrong disease, so they're stuck with the bill. And if word gets around that somebody was stuck with the bill who thought they were going to get free care, does that mean their neighbor doesn't go to the hospital when she gets sick?
So how do we address that problem?
I think it's a good time to have a little hiatus on out-of-pocket costs. I think there's a lot of people who can't afford it anyway, and insurance companies can be made whole. In fact, insurance companies, I don't know where they're going to come out this particular calendar year because there are all kinds of expensive elective procedures that aren't happening. So insurers may be flush for all we know by the time this is over. I don't know if that's true, but we can make insurers whole. We can't make somebody whole who died because they didn't get care in time, or who infected other people because they didn't realize that they should be isolating because they had COVID. So we need to just ban out-of-pocket costs for, say, 3 months.
So in a sense, what we're doing in a way is rationing all our available resources in favor of COVID-affected illnesses rather than other diseases. What are the implications of that? Are there any real concerns that we're now dramatically under-treating other conditions, and that's going to have significant both short-term and long-term consequences?
Yeah, there are. Go ahead, Monica.
I think we certainly hope it's not dramatic, but we all recognize that we're deferring all kinds of preventative care right now, both to keep hospitals at low capacity and also to keep people at low risk and to prevent spread. And, something that I think a lot about, because I care primarily for children with complex medical conditions, is that while that cohort is at some risk of COVID infection, they are also at high risk of declining health in the setting of missing therapy services, missing routine visits with their specialty and primary care providers. And so as we, I think what we all are mindful of is that as we make it past the first wave of challenging medical things to think about with the potential peak in COVID, there's likely to be a second and third and fourth impact as it pertains to dealing with the impact of both the lack of care or kind of deferred care, and also some of the mitigation strategies that have been enacted and have impacted a wide range of populations.
Now, that's a really good way of thinking of it. I mean, there's a lot of speculation in the media and elsewhere about the impact of the second wave. What everybody's talking about is the second wave of COVID. But what you're raising is the second and third and fourth wave of impact from undertreated other conditions during the focus on COVID, which I'm not sure very many people are beginning to calculate the impact of that. Let's shift to another topic, and I want to save some time for questions from our participants. But in your informed consent class and a lot of the stuff we do, we're constantly talking about, your clinical bioethics class, we're constantly talking about informed consent. What's happened to informed consent in this world of COVID treatment? In many instances, patients are not allowed to have visitors. Loved ones are not supposed to be close by. We're calling upon people to make decisions on their own that traditionally they would be able to consult with family members or clergy or whomever. So we're isolating people in making decisions. How is that impacting the relationship between doctors and patients? And how are patients coping with the fact that they're isolated in a decision-making setting, which they in the past could do with a lot of support?
Yeah, I think one of the things you're highlighting is that, you know, before we even talk about rationing or resource allocation, this is also an urgent call to ensure that when someone is critically ill and comes into the emergency department, we understand how they want to be treated, what their preferences are. Do they want to be intubated? Do they want to be on a ventilator? And as we think about how to guide people through this process, it highlights, I think, the important role of services like palliative care, not only as specialty providers, but also in thinking about how other clinicians are able to engage with patients around these complicated decisions. And we're asking clinicians to do this in a way that looks really different from how we'd like it to be done. These decisions are time sensitive, ideally not made when you yourself are in crisis, ideally made with a lot of people around you. And instead, we're in a situation where people are isolated and not able to share time and meaningful conversation with their loved one. And so it's really making us or challenging us to think differently about how we have those conversations in the acute setting, and also kind of in preparation for and after some of these decisions about things like intubation are made.
Well, in a way, I like your sense of how this really works, because you give the example of, you'll ask a patient before care is given, do you want to be intubated? And now it maybe they'll say, yes, I do, but then later on they'll say, well, no, you won't be, because we don't have the machine. And so it's a very different setting than we're accustomed to. You're asking people to make choices, and then at the back end, it's not their choice at all. They may very well want to be intubated and they may want to be ventilated, but there isn't a ventilator. So they say, we want it, and you say you can't have it. It's a very different version of informed consent than we're accustomed to.
And I would say, in addition to sort of the new tragedy of those decisions, it's also an entirely new type of conversation that we're asking clinicians to have with patients. And people here at Duke and elsewhere have thought hard about how to help providers have those conversations, how to provide scripts, how to provide just-in-time training. But the truth is, we haven't asked this of medical professionals previously. And so it's a really challenging thing to think about on the front line.
That must have a significant impact, emotional toll, on the clinicians, to be forcing them to change the model of how they're interacting with their patients at the same time when what they can do as clinicians is changing well. Is there a lot of talk and conversation about that? I mean, we talk about physician burnout and other settings, but have to wonder about having forced the current generation of clinicians through this crisis, what it's going to be, what it's going to do to them in the long run, or even in the short term.
I think it's a fair point. I certainly here at Duke and elsewhere, there's been a lot of time and attention to ensuring that physicians have outlets to talk with themselves, to talk with each other, to talk with professionals around some of these issues. But I think that's going to need to be a sustained effort because you're right. These are challenges I don't think any of us ever expected to face, and certainly don't want to face.
Relating back again to the visitors and the decision making, this is a conversation the three of us had when we were talking about this session today, and we were talking about the rules that generally prohibit visitors or dramatically restrict visitors, yet allow visitors when somebody's at the end of life, and that has some unexpected and surprising consequences. I think, Peter, you were talking about that during our earlier discussion.
Yeah, actually, Monica was.
Oh, it was Monica? I had it backwards. Monica, you're still on. I was trying to deflect it over to Peter.
No, I'm just enjoying hearing Monica talk about stuff. For sure.
So I'll say something, appropriately, most centers are waiving some of these restrictions around visitors at the end of life. It's already tragic to think about having a critically ill loved one who's alone. It is, that's compounded when we're thinking about patients who are soon to die or in the process of dying. But something that we have to think about is, as people are making decisions for themselves and their loved ones, we don't want to create an incentive where if people, really aren't sure, we don't know for sure that that the treatment won't be ineffective. We don't know for sure that, for example, this patient might die, but they desperately want to see their loved one last time. We don't want to create an incentive where decision-making is incentivized by the ability to be next to their loved one. And so palliative care clinicians and other types of clinicians are having to think hard about how to have those conversations to make sure that we're really uncovering the preferences of the individual or potentially of the surrogate.
So, Peter, this is one of these rules that's set up for one purpose and will have these odd effects where you're having people almost hoping that someone will say your father's going to die, so you get a chance to see him before he does or does not die. And you're almost wishing for bad news because that would give you the opportunity for a last visit that you might not otherwise have.
Yeah, I mean, and so that's really troubling speculation. I hope it's never true. And in fact, I doubt anyone ever would hope for the worst just so they could see their loved one. I think if they knew that their loved one wasn't going to survive, they'd want to know that they had a warning so they could come and visit rather than it happening suddenly and they couldn't. But I think most people are quite happy to not see their loved one if it means they're going to survive. So it's hard to know how it's going to play out, but it is another big part of the emotional toll that is for the patient, for the family, and in fact, that also to the nurses and the other healthcare workers who are involved. That's got to add to their stress too, to be faced with these terrible circumstances.
Let me just explore a couple of related topics with the two of you for a moment, and then we'll throw it open to questions from the folks on the chat room. Is that there's a huge rush to manufacture more equipment and to develop treatments and to develop vaccines, and a lot of pressure to relax, if not completely suspend, normal concerns about efficacy or safety. What are the implications of that? And then also, what are the implications for all the research that would normally be done in other diseases? We talked to a number of people in pharmaceutical companies, and they basically said, we stopped doing anything but try and figure out what we can do about COVID-19. And therefore, it's what we had averted to before, which is Monica's second or third wave of concerns about other illnesses because of the delays in that research.
Yeah, I'll say that I think we have had way too little investment in research on viral illnesses more generally, and especially in trying to develop treatments that are going to work when a new virus comes around we haven't seen before. So it's crazy. We'd never say, well, then let's have a pandemic so that we'll finally put money into that rather than to other things. That never be how you do it. But we've been chronically underspending in it. And we've been underspending because there's not money to be made. If you made the treatment that cured SARS, if you finally got it out to market, the epidemic was done, you would have just lost a whole bunch of money. And so we definitely have to think chronically, how do we get more companies to work on developing products, make it financially worthwhile for them for a pandemic that may or may not happen.
Monica, any reactions to those questions before we open it up to questions from our chat room?
No, I think it's a good time for questions.
Okay, Tim, we're over to you. I know you and Ben have been curating, and I see we've got 92 people in the chat room. So let's see what they have on their mind.
Absolutely. I want to return to actually that last question. The question coming in is about the widespread political and policy sentiment we're hearing of why waste a good crisis. And the question is, what can be done to combat efforts to push through and rush through policies that lower the safety and quality of care because they are politically expedient, and we are approaching an election in which politicians are in position?
Who wants to field that?
That's a really easy question.
Peter? I asked the easy questions, and now they're getting hard.
Let's start with the medical risk-benefit kind of questions. Let's get at that, because I don't think that has to be politicized for it to still be really difficult trade-offs. Normally, we go through laborious, slow it down if we have to, FDA review of new drugs, because we want to bring good things to market, but we want to make sure that they're safe and effective before we do so. In the middle of a pandemic, we're going to start changing a little bit of the threshold. We're going to maybe put something out a little faster, hopefully monitoring it very carefully, and then pulling it out back if it's not good. But we're going to see a little change in that risk-benefit ratio and how we balance things. And that's not politics. That's not helping anybody get reelected. That's trying to save lives. Now, that's different from questions about when and how to open up the economy. And I would just on that, I would say, I don't think there's a trade-off between controlling the virus and getting the economy back in. If we don't control the virus, the economy doesn't really come back, or it comes back briefly and then we're shut down again. And I think the consequences of a second major shutdown on people's long-term behavior and the economics that follow from that would be way bigger than getting this first reopening right, even if it means a little slower.
Monica, did you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's sufficient. Yeah.
Well, good. A follow-up on that, Peters, you mentioned the changing of the risk-benefit calculation. Can you dive into that a little bit and talk about how you see that risk-benefit calculation shifting in this time of crisis?
Well, I think there are a lot of medicines where you don't know what the side effects are. Lots and lots of people have had them. You like to have very big trials come to the FDA so that you get a better sense of these side effects. I think when things are so bad and so urgent, you're probably going to bring something to market with a smaller study than you might otherwise have done, where the benefits are starting to show up, but the side effects and the long-term hazards, we don't know enough about it. And that's just probably, when you know that the downside of the pandemic is so large, that's got to be part of that equation.
Absolutely. So I want to shift over to the question of decision making. There's a lot of questions about bias, and there's also questions about patient education. So this comes from one of our participants who says that they have a physical disability, and they're asking, there's worry in the disability community right now about a quote unquote eugenics movement, and they would like to know how we are working with doctors, how triage groups are working with doctors to ensure that people with disabilities are not labeled as simply, they don't have a life worth living based on a physical or mental disability, and how that education is going out to doctors and how we can prevent people from essentially being labeled as not having a life worth living for those factors.
What an important question. So I will say, first and foremost, critical to a lot of these protocols, or really all of these protocols, is the idea that there is a process that is removed from the individual clinician who is sitting in front of the patient and making a decision about a ventilator, for example. And there are a lot of reasons why that's critical. One of them is that a team of people who have an algorithm or some type of process that has been agreed upon by stakeholders are less likely to, for example, look at an individual who is sitting in front of them and make an inaccurate claim around how their, for example, baseline disability might impact something like quality of life or social worth. And so something that is, I think, absolutely critical to all of these processes is that there is a team that is working from an objective and kind of recognizing that objective, it's an imperfect use of the word objective, but as objective as possible, document and process that absolutely does not include a priori exclusion criteria that discriminate against people with baseline disability. And so that process, in addition to any document, has to be a process that separates the individual clinician from these decisions.
If I can actually dive into that, you hit on the next question without even meaning to, I think. And the question is about who is making those decisions at a you mentioned a triage group or a committee. And then the next question on that would be, is there an appeal process if patients or even providers who are not making those decisions feel that the decision has been made incorrectly?
Also great question. So the triage team makeup is going to depend obviously on individual policy or institution. Most people recognize that any team has to consist of not only experts in critical care medicine, pediatric critical care medicine, neonatal critical care medicine, but also people with expertise in ethics, people with expertise and in equity, and people who know something about how to engage with the community. And so those teams really are expected to look broader than a group of, for example, ICU clinicians who should be in the room, who need to be in the room because they're content experts. But that has to be augmented by a broader team. As for the appeal process, I'm not expert on what all those look like, but I will say that most protocols do have some way to deal with this idea that if someone disagrees with a decision, that there's a way for it to be appealed.
Excellent.
Don't you risk, let me just pop in here 1 second, Monica, don't you risk, since there is no enforced consistency across hospitals or hospital systems about these kinds of criteria, that you'll end up having particular hospitals getting reputations of being more or less sensitive to pre-existing disabilities, and you'll end up with hospital shopping by the disability community in a place where they end up being more reasonably received.
Yeah, I guess I want to reiterate what Monica said. I do not know of any criteria or algorithm, practice plan that's out there that looks at people with pre-existing cognitive or physical disability, makes that a major criteria or even a minor one. That's not where people are thinking. I can't vouch that there isn't some hospital or some hospital system somewhere that won't take a very different view of that. I would expect they would very much worry not only about public relations issues, they might worry about legal implications if that's not what most people in the field are doing. These are extraordinary times. Hospitals are largely know that if they do a good faith effort to help as many people as they can, they should be okay, even though they're making unusual decisions. But I think a hospital or hospital system that went way out of the mainstreaming, we don't ventilate people in wheelchairs. That would be extraordinary and very risky, legally and certainly morally.
I hope you're right. Lawyers don't usually get good credits in these situations, but it sounds like the presence of lawyers, the potential presence of lawyers, creates the right incentives here. Tim, let's throw it back to you. I think we've got, time for a couple more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. This one actually relates directly the same sort of topic of triage decisions. And if we were two patients come in and evaluated based on criteria, and let's say the first patient gets the ventilator, if a third patient were to present, is the patient who was not given the ventilator sort of re-entered into this competition, or are they considered to have been decided on already?
Really tough question. And I'll say that the reason, or one of the reasons that, for example, the multi-permutation framework doesn't include exclusion criteria is because it wants to allow for the possibility that what if a hospital gets 50 new ventilators? We don't want anyone sitting out there who can't receive one. And so, yes, every patient, if they were, for example, did not receive a ventilator based on a certain priority score, that decision isn't sort of final. They continue to have access to critical care resources based on resource availability.
Absolutely. So if we could go to a topic that, same topic, but has really been in the news, obviously, before the pandemic really blew up in this country, so to speak, we saw the Houston Rockets and the Utah Jazz getting tests within hours, when no one else in the country, and certainly no one in Texas, was able to be getting tests at that fast. And we do seem to see a lot of celebrities and other notable people getting tested at a much higher rate. Is that true? That's the first question. And if it's true, what ethical issues are we talking about here, and how is that going to have a long-term effect on our society and our equity and access to healthcare?
That's a really, really good question. And I don't know the details about how some of these professional teams have gotten such access to tests. There were clearly people who tested positive after symptoms, and then teammates who had exposure. So there would have been an indication for testing when you've had close contact with somebody who has an infection. There were a group of Duke students out traveling in Israel, and a few of them got sick, and they all got tested, and we found out a lot of them came down with the virus from that. So that is one of the indications for testing. I can't imagine that testing is being distributed completely fairly, and that rich people aren't getting special access to things. Rich people get special access to everything in this country. Maybe, and again, this is something where you hope we learn a little bit from this and realize that when it comes to buying luxury cars, it's fine for them to have special access if they've got the money, but probably not life-saving tests.
Absolutely. Monica, did you have anything on that?
No, I would just concur.
Wonderful. So then I'm just going to go with the last question here I have. And this sort of goes into where Peter ended, which is the future. So after we will beat this, we will come out the other side of this. So what we have to ask ourselves is how this impacts triage decisions going forward, how we're setting protocols in preparation for the next pandemic. And this is a lot of questions, so you don't have to get to all of them. How we make sure that we have PPE and ventilator stockpiles. Is it as simple as saying go buy more? Because I really doubt it is. And then how this impacts medical training for medical students. We're obviously going to have to adjust curriculum to deal with this sort of situation. So if you could just, for the next few minutes, talk about the future of triage decision-making and rationing, I think that would be a great way to end this one.
If I can take on the equipment thing, and then maybe Monica can end with the medical student and medical school training and things. There's actually an economist at Duke, Leslie Marks, who co-authored something. We're looking at how, let's suppose you had a bunch of equipment that you wanted to put into storage in case an epidemic ran around. So first off, that raises questions about having a system that's so lean and mean, so much run like a business, that you can't afford to have unused ventilators sitting in a hallway. That's money not well spent by a hospital. So as a country, we need to invest in having those resources available. But in addition, things that sit in a closet unused for 10 years don't work when you need them. And so there's actually people working out the idea that, okay, we have a stockpile of let's make it ventilators or make it PPE equipment. And then the stuff that's 3 years old gets sold to somebody at discount and is replaced with new stuff. So everything in the closet's 3 years or less older. And I made up all those numbers. But the idea is they're really smart people who think we can figure this out, how to have a stockpile and not to have it go to waste.
And I'll start to answer maybe the first and last part of your question. So what does this mean for triage decisions moving forward? And you know, a lot of these ideas that we're talking about aren't new. They have been developed over time in the face of other pandemics, but certainly this pandemic has brought an urgency to those decisions and to those protocols and discussions that I think we've all felt I've certainly felt in a new way. And my hope is that this is an opportunity to really clarify how we think about these things in real time, both ethically, but also logistically. Like, how would we operationalize this in the hopefully unlikely scenario that it occurs? And so it's my hope that this advances our thinking about how to do this ethically and appropriately. And also that we maybe think in a new way about how we engage the community around these topics, but because I think the urgency of this situation in some cases has meant that there has been less of an opportunity to talk about some of these protocols with people within the community who probably have important ideas about how we should think about this, for example, at Duke or in the state of North Carolina. And so I hope that moving forward, we feel that urgency, or we use that urgency to do this more effectively should it ever be needed. And then to answer your question around medical education, I think we all agree that this is, I think, a career-changing event for all of us, including young trainees. And when I think about what this has the potential to help inform trainees around, it might be around how do we think in new ways about telehealth delivery? How do we think in new ways about preparing for emergencies? How do we think in new ways about protecting populations, nimbly and in a way that provides fair care to as many people? How do we think in new ways about health disparities so that we're not left having these discussions at kind of the final hour as it pertains to resource allocations? And so I think my hope is that we talked before about second and third and fourth impact of this. I hope that academically and within community, we feel something similar, which is that we can think in new ways 6 months from now. How should we reframe how we deliver healthcare to chronically ill patients now that we know we can do a lot of care through virtual visits? And so it's my hope that at the end of this we'll have gained something as well.
Sadly, one of the challenges here is, as hard as everyone will no doubt work to figure out what the lessons learned from this particular pandemic were, whether anyone will ever pay attention to them is really the question. I heard a talk by Ron Klain recently, who was the head of the response to the most recent pandemic. As he sat around at the White House response, and as he sat around with his team putting together the final report on lessons learned, he asked how many of them had read the lessons learned report from the anthrax event, and virtually no one on his team who had prepared the lessons learned had read the lessons learned from the previous experience. And so unfortunately, that's very telling. And so I think the challenge for us is, number one, to figure out what we learned, extract those lessons, and then make sure somehow we figure out how to pay attention to them downstream and we're not reinventing it at the back end. Well, we've got just 2 minutes left. Monica, Peter, let me thank you for taking the time to do this. A very insightful and disturbing in many ways conversation. It's wonderful to know that you two are both on the front lines here, trying to help us sort our way through this incredibly challenging period. So thank you for sharing that with all the people on the call, and we're very grateful. Tim, any closing remarks? I know we want to do a little promotion future events and let people know what's coming. So why don't you say a few things and then I'll add it.
Thank you. But thank you, Buzz, also for your moderation. I just want to encourage folks to check out the Duke Science and Society website to get more information about what we do here at Science and Society, to check out our Master of Arts in Bioethics, Tech Ethics, and Science Policy, get information on that in case you're looking to vacation in these fields. Monica and Peter are both resources at Duke that we engage with at Science and Society, and you can come and learn from them. And finally, just go ahead and RSVP for our next coronavirus conversation. It's going to be this Thursday, April 16th at noon, and we're going to be discussing arts, how they can be a balm and a solace to us in these times, and what art will look like after the pandemic. And we have a great panel of artists and scholars who are going to share with us their insights and some of their artistic practices so that we can be better people as we are not able to go out and go to museums and other institutions.
And just as a reminder for those of you who've been on the call, if you know people who want to hear the conversation, it's recorded and will be posted. And for everybody who RSVP'd, we'll send out a notice as to where you can find that. So anything else from you, Tim?
Just encourage people to stay home and wear masks when they go out so that we can flatten the curve, but that's it. Everyone be safe. We seem to be living in biblical times. We're trying to overcome a pandemic and we get tornadoes. So it's a difficult time for everyone to be safe and make our way through it. The physical concerns are as much as important as the emotional and psychological concerns. So everyone take care of themselves. With that, we'll close. Again, Dr. Lemmon, Dr. Ubel, thank you for participating. Thanks, Tim. Thank you.